Well, I just had an outtake moment. I forgot to put my earphones on and I started talking and it might work out okay, but not really. But good morning. Today we're going to talk about some stuff that's starting to get really interesting. I hope this little iPad keeps working while I get into it. Last night I was watching the video again, and I thought I was just enthralled, sitting there watching this thing, and even though I wrote this thing, it was just still a complete turn on to sit there and watch myself telling this story. At any rate, let's get right to it. We were sitting in a kind of a hot tub. It was made out of rock, but it was also pretty much artificial. It had some sculpted seats in it. I was sitting in one of the seats in this hot tub, and I was just, my mind was just blank, but I was ready to absorb. Pinky, from the time we started our hike, Pinky was just talking a mile a minute. And of course, I can't tell everything she said in those first hours, but Pinky was sitting across from me in this hot tub, and then she said she needed to continue her lecture. So I looked at her and I said, "I'm all ears." Pinky said that about 5 yards up the bank above the pool was an entrance to the underground of Stag Hammer. She said, "We'll go there after she talks for a while." She said, "For this first trip, all of our work for the week will be here in this place." She told me it was my father's base of operations. She says it's quite large and comfortable below ground. You will be surprised at how large it is. She said that when she first came here with my father, they also stayed right here. She said that within an hour of leaving the pool, his father had her hooked up to a learning device, and she went to sleep until the next morning. She woke up realizing something miraculous had happened overnight. She knew a lot of details about Stag Hammer and the installation. She told me that she knew the map of the monorail, although that was not the name the people used for it. She knew the details about how the food was prepared for her and my father and how it was delivered. She was surprised but not shocked. Even at 6 years old, she told me that somehow she realized that she was not as she seemed. Her mom was indeed Sharon, but her father was unknown. She told me that she suspected her father was my father, but couldn't prove it. People here most likely knew, but they weren't saying. She jumped ahead in her lecture a bit when she said that after she had been coming here for a couple of years and had several procedures performed on her, she had been informed that her father could not make her pregnant, but that his son could. She then told me that when they told her this, she wondered if they had slipped in their translation, or were they telling her, in fact, that my father was indeed her father. She had been told before about a son, or that he would soon make himself known, but she knew when they said that I would be along sometime. Pinky told me that she didn't think I would appear this soon, but it was not a problem. Is Pinky really my half-sister? Pinky continued, saying that on that first day his father had taken her several miles via the Bullet to a medical area of the underground. There she had been examined and had the first procedure performed. They told her they were going to enhance her mental facilities and had done things to her genes that made it very unlikely she would ever get sick for any known reason. They also told her that she couldn't get pregnant until another procedure was performed in the future, when it became her will to do so. She also told me that when her father and her had quiet times together, that he would finish up by hooking her to the learning apparatus. It was quite effective, she said, as she could remember everything about Stag Hammer she had learned since she had come that first time. Then Pinky told me a most fantastic tale. It was unbelievable, to say the least. She said that one of the procedures was to prepare her for transition. She explained that the people told her they were going to take her on a couple of trips. She said they said she would first go to L5. Well, she asked where L5 was. Then they matter-of-factly said it's one of the Lagrange points in the lunar orbit. She said she asked how long it would take, and she didn't want to be gone very long, like 2 days, and she should be headed home. They told her it would actually take negative time as far as her home was concerned. She was told that she would be at L5 for a week, but as far as Earth was concerned, it would be like 20 minutes. She had learned something about it in those first 2 nightly learning sessions, but there were no real details there about how it actually worked. She said if that meant she asked if that meant she was going to go on a spaceship. And they said that no, it was from right here and would not take any time at all. Pinky paused to let that sink in. Well, she moved away and dipped her face in the pool and reached up to a ledge on her side and came away with a bar of soap. She lathered up her face and hair, and when she finished, her hair gleamed in the dappled sunlight. She tossed me the soap, and I washed my hair and face. I felt refreshed. Tossing it back, she replaced it on the ledge. She continued. She said that when the medical procedure was complete, which was done by 2 medical robots beside her head, they took her back to his father as he had been having a procedure of his own. She was told that she would leave in 1 hour. She sat with Mac, Pop, in a sort of sidewalk cafe and had a sandwich prepared and delivered in what seemed to be less than a minute. Then they came for her. She said that she was actually looking forward to it, as the preparations had been so low-key that she was sure she would enjoy the trip. Pop then said that she was going alone, as he had other duties to perform. He said that she would have an escort at every moment, except for when she was asleep, hooked to the learning machine. The trip itself was as if nothing had happened. She was put in a chamber and told to stand on the circle and hang on to the hand grips at waist high. The door closed and then it opened. She told me that she thought something had gone wrong and that she wouldn't be going on the trip anyway. Well, she said she turned and stared at the door. She said there were many people outside the door all looking at her. Behind them, she could see that the wall was all windows. She said that the place was oriented so that the present view was of Earth from L5. The lessons had covered the Lagrange points thoroughly, so she knew instantly what she was looking at, and that she had indeed traveled there instantaneously. One of the people in the group outside the chamber detached herself and beckoned her to come out. She felt a little light on her feet, but she thought the local gravity was a little less than on Earth. She thought it was very likely that their home planet had gravity equal to what she was experiencing at the moment. She walked out the door, and every one of the people outside were softly clapping their hands. My escort said that I was welcome, and that I was the first person from Earth to visit. Pinky then stopped for a minute. She continued, saying that the details of that first trip were not important, as I would be going there soon myself. She did say that after that first trip to L5, she had effectively spent several years on the people's home planet, while local Earth time was effectively nil. She said that now I should know why it is that she is literally 27 years old in a 10-year-old body. She said that the people had altered her genes so that at the moment she hardly aged. At the time of her choosing, she could revert to her normal aging as she had her babies to become star men and women. Pinky then ended her lecture by saying that we should get underground to start my training for my future of taking care of Stag Hammer and interfacing with the people when they return. She said that whether I liked it or not, this was my future. Along with our 15 or 20 babies driving us ragged as they grew, waiting for their turn at becoming caretakers for Stag Hammer. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but that's close. I was excited. An incredulous tale, but it was obviously true in all aspects. How could anyone make up such a story? I had no idea what was in store for me. Back in the big house, I woke easily as my internal sense told me I had a message, and that it would start as I came awake and sat up in bed. I unwrapped my arms from Gracie and sat up. She came awake and looked at me sitting up and sat up alongside me. I asked if she was having trouble sleeping, and she hesitated and then said no, she had just had a thought, and it woke her up. My message delivered and was understood, I turned to Gracie and put my arms around her. She simply said that she was ready to sleep again. As we quieted and lay quietly, I listened to her breathing becoming regular and knew she was fast asleep. I lay there and thought over what had happened the night before at supper. Strange was a good description for what happened as we finished and began dessert, as Shelley brought it and delivered the last portion to her mother and prepared to sit beside her. She hesitated as she looked at her father as he cleared his throat, preparing to speak. We heard the unusual noise, and everyone at the table and Shelley standing turned to look. Mark was looking at his plate and then looked up and said simply, "I'm going to go away tonight." He continued, saying it will be permanent. "I'm going to come back in the morning for breakfast and will bring a guest. She is close to me and is someone you all know." Gracie didn't seem too surprised. At least she didn't scream and throw things. She asked Mark to verify it was permanent, and he replied that it was. Gracie looked over to me and then back to Mark, who sat there with a neutral look on his face. Gracie then turned her body toward me and said, "Mac, I would like to spend the night with you, if you don't mind." Watching the interaction between Mark and his wife, I got the impression that for Gracie at least, it wasn't a big shock. As Gracie sat there looking at me, I surprised myself as I immediately gave my reply. I said, "Of course." Gracie smiled and looked at Mark, who had a smile as well. Mark said, "Gracie, good move." "And thank you, Mac." Shelley, Pinky, and Sharon were all paying very close attention, and as Mark thanked me, they all turned to look at me, and nearly as one, they all smiled and murmured, "Super, wow, cool." Mark then got to his feet, moved beside Gracie, and bent down and kissed her on the lips as he hugged her. They parted, and he moved to Shelley, who was still standing behind her mother. He said, "Sweetheart, I'll always cherish your memory," as he gave her a hug. Mark moved around the table, and after Sharon's hug, finally held his hand out for me. I grasped his hands, and both of us moved to grasp the other with both hands. He then moved to Pinky and called her honey, as he held her in his arms and kissed her on the cheek. Mark stood up straight. Kind of emotional, but this is the way it works sometimes, I suppose. Mark stood up straight and walked away through the kitchen and out the door leading to their bungalow. We heard his car start and quietly drive away down the lane. Gracie then stood up and said that she would appreciate it if we would all help out cleaning up and washing dishes. She said that she was anxious to get busy getting laid and didn't want to waste any time doing it. We all erupted in laughter as her statement diffused the somewhat tense atmosphere. I think we were all absorbing what had just happened. and in spite of our joviality, we all were anxious to find out at breakfast who our mystery guest would be. Would there be some additional information presented? We all turned to, and shortly Gracie and I were climbing the stairs together, with Shelley headed for the third floor, as Sharon and Pinky headed down to walk to their home. Well, in the morning, he woke up with Gracie gone. So after a short shower and cleanup, with Gracie gone early, presumably fixing our breakfast as usual, I headed out my door and saw Shelley just coming into the hall from her upstairs apartment. I waited. Is there something going on with this video? There we go. I waited and took her hand and walked her into the dining room where we all ate our meals. I could see the second table insert had been installed for our unknown guest. The table had been set for 7. Pinky and I were able to spread out a little, but our guest had the center position between Gracie and Shelley with normal separation. Mark was not present as yet, but as we gathered at the table, with Gracie setting the food platters out, we heard the front door open, and Mark's voice saying, "Follow me." The two of them came through the door to the dining room. Immediately, the girls all said, "Cheyenne!" Our guest said, "Hey, people." We all knew Cheyenne as the manager of the second most popular grocery store in Middletown. We knew a lot about her, as she had been in town the longest anybody knew, a fixture. She always greeted everybody who came through the store by name, including all the children, babies, and dogs and cats. She knew everybody, and everybody knew her. Like old home week, we gathered around her and said our hellos with hugs thrown in for good measure. She seemed to take charge naturally as she said, "Let's eat, I'm hungry." In mere moments, we all, including Mark, were filling our plates. We ate with gusto, as it seemed that even with such short timing, Gracie had prepared a delightful breakfast. Well, I think that all of us were thinking that Mark had found another woman, as Cheyenne was a delightful person who was very good-looking and seemed to be actually a little older than Mark. I looked at her across the table from me and had a sudden thought that she couldn't be as young as she looked, knowing her history of being in town for at least 60 and maybe 80 years. I had talked to some in town who remarked on how ageless she seemed. Some even said their grandparents had known her before she started the grab-bag grocery store. Most had no idea when the store had opened. It seemed it had been open a long time, some said. But even those thoughts were obscured by her wit and ability to effortlessly include everybody with whatever conversation was going on. So we all enjoyed her company, even as questions were fleetingly passing through our minds. Breakfast wound down as we cleaned our plates. Gracie and Shelley stood up and gathered breakfast detritus, and in short order were back in their seats. Cheyenne quietly began talking. She said that she needed to explain what was going on. I suppose what was going through my mind was what in the world could she explain? I knew for a fact she had nothing to do with Stag Hammer or any of the internal workings of the mountain. Was Mark involved with some scheme he had been talked into, where he and Cheyenne would be opening another store in another place in some get-rich-quick plan? Cheyenne spoke the words, Shenandoah, Augustine 14. I felt a wash over my head as if the entire Pacific had gone through my head. I uttered a small squeak, and then, oh my! I realized in that moment I had acquired an additional huge knowledge base. I knew instinctively also it had been there all along, but not accessible. Cheyenne's word string was a code that unlocked it. I heard around me noises that let me know everyone at the table had instantaneously also discovered their hidden database. I looked at each in turn, including Mark, and they all had a sort of stupefied look as they sat there investigating their sudden gift. They slowly turned to look at Cheyenne. She was sitting there calmly, watching us come to grips with what had just happened. She said, "Present your comm unit." I pulled my square device out of my pocket and placed it on the newly cleared table in front of me. I saw movement around the table as each one of us, including Cheyenne, laid their newly described comm unit on the table. Now I knew that when I received the instruction to bring the comm unit with me to breakfast, all the rest of the family here had received an identical command. Gracie had been getting her message as she sat up in bed beside me. Well, Cheyenne started by telling us that we now knew about the projects and details about things, but added that there were some things not in our database. She said that she wanted to fill out some details, and some things she said we now know, but she wanted to go over it anyway. She started by shocking us all. She said she wanted us to know that Mark is my brother. She continued by saying that she and Mark were both very old. She said she was the oldest in our family, with Mark being the next oldest. She told us she had 4 other sisters and 4 other brothers. She told us that she had not seen any of her family except Mark for at least 2,000 years. She continued by telling us she had been on Earth -2 here for 1,600 years. She said that Mark was assigned here 200 years after she had established the base here. Now it starts to make some sense, I thought. Aloud, I said, "Please continue." She continued by saying that we should all know that the available Earth worlds has Earth prime and going from plus 26 to minus 13. Everybody around the table were now coming to terms with their new data and were agreeing with Cheyenne. Cheyenne then gave us another shock. She said that she didn't want us to get the wrong impression, but she wanted us all to know that she had been assigned Earth -2 leader, as she came here 1,600 years ago. She said that she was our leader. She stopped talking as we digested that last. I thought I had often wondered who was in charge here. Who was the top authority who was responsible for Stag Hammer? Now I knew. Cheyenne paused for another moment, looked down at the table, and her hands clasped there. She looked up and asked if we had any question to ask or points to make. None of us wanted to break the flow, so we all shook our heads. She told us that her talk was going to take a while, so if at any time we wanted to take a break or go for more coffee, we would stop and we would do that. We all acknowledged that. She then talked about the time translation part of our database. She told us that the time translation to another of the Earth group began with the system taking note of our departure location and local departure time. Any return would normally be simultaneous with the departure. Keeps the person naturally up to date, normally, but not always. She said the time and location of arrival would only be present time, the advancing timeline, or sometime in the future. Never negative time. She told us to forget going backwards in time. She said it was possible, but because of several scenarios that ended in disaster, she would be personally consulted for permission for negative time travel. She told us that there had been only 2 requests made in her lifetime in charge, and neither was approved. She continued saying, "Don't waste my time. I will not approve it." Cheyenne continued saying traveling and returning to future time would result in resetting time 0 to that point. She said that we only had to change the settings on the initiation translation point, and we could only go to any time in the future. From that point, we could never go back to our natural return time as if we had not changed the setting time. She said that we should think carefully before we did that. She continued by saying a second setting point on the translator would advance the natural return time to match current time as it moved steadily ahead. There were several reasons to do this, but didn't expand on any details. She said that changing the return time to anything other than time 0 should be carefully considered. She looked around the table and asked if we had anything to say. The table sat quietly, so Cheyenne said we should take a break, that she needed coffee. She also said that we were going on to more specific items that affected us in this morning's presentation. The coffee was delicious. Cheyenne continued. She started by telling us something we had never thought of. She said that Earth Prime had discovered how to access other timelines, and after exploring the different Earth timelines, had then discovered that there were actually a finite number of them that could reasonably be considered. Then the bombshell. She said Earth Prime had discovered that process many thousands of years ago. Then she said that that had been the only scientific advance made in the travel to different worlds. She said that natural barriers prevented any travel to any other solar systems. These barriers, however, allowed slow sublight speed travel that had never been considered due to the enormous time necessary to complete the journey. Until now, she said, she told us that Prime had decided to try translating to the moon and found that it was theoretically possible, so a trial setup had been built and found translating to be possible. This actually led to the setup of the Lagrange stations on nearly all of the 40 Earth systems group. This effectively short-range translation capability had existed for many centuries and was utilized extensively for star system evaluation in the universe with orbital telescopes and other devices. Problem is, Prime had never found a practical star travel method and systems which would allow experimentation with translator galactic travel. Cheyenne stopped and looked at us, and then at Mark. Then she continued with our journey in discovery. She said that because of these basic facts, Prime had decided to build and send off a spacecraft destined to arrive at the nearest star system, the Centauri system, in some long time frame. She told us that the ship had been built. The all-volunteer crew had been selected, and the time of departure had been set. The technique of the trip would be to depart, and then the crew would take turns going into deep hibernation for extended periods of time. She told us that the crew of Prime Spacecraft 1 would very likely not ever be seen again. It is considered a one-way trip to see if at the end of their journey they could set up and try to get operational a long-distance translator system. That is, if a suitable planet could be found in that far-off system. She stopped and sat back in her chair. Confused, we all waited for her to continue. She finally raised her head and fixed her gaze on Mark. Mark had been sitting quietly while Cheyenne talked about going to the Centauri system. When she stopped talking, he looked down at the table for some moments. He slowly raised his head and quietly said, "I'm going on that trip." Gracie unconsciously stood up as she absorbed that incredible information. She moved to Mark and enveloped him in her arms. The rest of us slowly stood and moved toward the head of the table to show our support, and as I reasoned later, to kill a few moments while we were all trying not to cry. Cheyenne cleared her throat and exclaimed, "Children, there's more to the story. Please take your seats. Please be seated." We sat and finally composed ourselves, and as we did, Cheyenne got out her comm unit. She told us to get ours out and place them on the table in front of us. She said she was going to talk about the comm unit for a minute or so while we got ourselves composed. She told us the comm unit communicated with comm master control and knew every person who was authorized to use one. She added that if we mixed them up, the unit we wound up with would recognize if the person holding it was authorized or not. If authorized, the unit would then load up the data belonging to that person. The process was as foolproof as the scientists of Prime could make them. If an unauthorized person held one, it would be completely inert. I realized that every person at the table had one. I had no idea there was anybody but Pinky and I who even knew of the contents of Stag Hammer. I watched as Sharon looked at Shelley and remarked, "You have one too?" Cheyenne showed us that we had not seen anything yet. She asked them to move them into a circle in the center of the table. She touched the screen on hers and entered an instruction. Faint lines appeared that focused on a point about 2 feet in the air over the circle. A hologram-looking person appeared at the focus, perfectly in focus, and was of a male person. The figure spoke. "I am Prime President Jorge Simons. I welcome you, Seven, as you find yourself involved in a long-term project brought into being by a group of scientists on Earth Prime." He continued, "I personally challenge you all to accept your part in this scheme with all your heart. Mark has already signaled he is ready to go on the first journey of galactic exploration, which he is sure to find challenging in turn." He added, "Godspeed in your endeavors. Cheyenne, if you will, please continue." The figure faded. Cheyenne asked us to take back our comm units and put them away. She said we would not be needing them again for this meeting. She continued, "Okay, you have Mark's part of this grand adventure." She looked at me and said that I was to have a major part also in the search for capabilities for galactic travels. She said that primetime scientists had developed ways to monitor future events. She said that there was an infant who had been seen to develop a technique associated with space travel, but was overall not successful in his life to achieve his goal. In fact, she continued, there are several instances of young people who appear to have focused their lives on the search. Mac, if you agree, we would like to send you to an Earth where one such has just been born. He is at present 6 weeks old. Would you agree to live some years with this family if possible, to help this youngster develop his life in this search? We would suggest that at some point you would expose him and his family to the project and have him travel with his family to Prime to continue his studies. Will you agree? I always thought it was a quick study, and perhaps in haste I immediately answered, "Sure, I'll do it." Cheyenne nodded and said that as soon as we finished up here, she would show me the house's translator room. And from now on, the people in this room will use it to translate to where they have decided to go. She looked at the table and said that, for the time being, Mac will come and go in time zero settings. Later on, I would guess he will choose to use the advancing timeline setting, where you may not see him for several years. The rest of you will continue your lives here in support of the new ranch manager who has been selected from our people to continue our support here at the ranch. You will serve for the time being to be here to welcome Mac when he comes and goes. This is a major effort that unfortunately will take many years to complete, but you will all know at this time that your bodies and minds have been modified to allow near infinite lifespans. I would suggest you not waste a minute of it. I cannot say you will not be called to do some additional task. I ask you all to keep an open mind. She finished. We all stood up, and I, sort of in jest, said that I would see them all in a few minutes. Mark said that if I was successful and a search for a galactic travel system was successful, someone would come and locate him on his way to the Centauri system and bring him home. For the next few years, I came back for a few months at a time on self-directed periods of downtime away from my prime duties. Cheyenne personally set the translator for Mac to a specific place on Earth Plus 23. She left the translator and walked out to join Mark, Pinky, Shelley, Sharon, and Gracie, who had all trooped down to the basement to see me off. Then Cheyenne stepped into the now empty translator once more with Mark and made some setting changes to enable translation to Spaceship Prime 1. Cheyenne said that Mark had chosen to set the return time to advancing rather than time zero. This pretty much ensured he would not be seen again for many hundreds of years. She stepped out of the room and closed the door. A moment later, she opened the door. It was again empty. The translator worked once again. I found myself in Hawaii in a prime installation. After a month of working with prime people, and of course laying on the beach and enjoying myself, I traveled to Kyoto, Japan. Well, Mac has started a new part of his adventure. When I first started this story, I had no idea this was going to happen. I just had no idea. I sit and I type away, and it just kind of boils out of me. And at the end of the day, I typically go back and read over and over again what I had written, and I had no idea where it came from. I'm just wondering if in a past Buddhist life that I hadn't actually lived an adventure like this. And again, that is exactly why I say I have no idea where this stuff comes from. At any rate, we'll start part 2 of the story tomorrow. Good afternoon.